Welcome to Bespoken Bones with your host, Pavini Moray, connecting ancestors, sex, magic and science. Pavini explores transpersonal tools for erotic wellness every new and full moon, engaging educators, healers, spiritual leaders and scientists in revolutionary dialogue. Get ready to feel good and go deep. This is Bespoken Bones.
Hi, and welcome to Bespoken Bones, ancestors at the crossroads of sex, magic, and science. We're in the business of healing trauma, connecting with our roots, and developing radiant erotic wellness in past, present, and future generations. I'm your host, Pavini Moray. I've been so delighted to hear from so many of you about the way the podcast is landing with you. It's very nourishing and also inspiring to me personally to know the impact that it's having. So really wanting to encourage you to continue reaching out with your questions, your comments, your exciting ideas of people and topics that you'd like to hear on the show. And you can do that on the contact form at bespokenbones.com. Today, it's an honor and a pleasure to introduce you Elinor Predota, and she is a mentor to radical change makers. Elinor lives in rural southern Scotland. She is a queer witch, a storyteller, a poet, a singer, and an artist. Elinor has a long and wide-ranging background in activism, community development, spiritual counseling, ritual work, and both formal and informal education. And her work centers around the magic of creativity, of relating across difference, and of becoming alive to all that is present within and without us here and now. She is constantly and eternally grateful to the corporeal and non-corporeal beings of all species with whom she shares her life. I first met Elinor when I stayed at her cottage in Scotland with her and her partner while I was on ancestral pilgrimage. She took me in. She didn't know me. She took me in. And gave me shelter and food and nourishment and practiced magic with me. And she also helped me understand how stories get encoded into the land as a means of cultural preservation in the face of colonization. And since I met Elinor, my relationship with her has continued and deepened because we meet weekly. She's my dissertation coach, and she has held my hand through the very arduous task of completing almost my dissertation, and her unique blend of magic, academia, great politics, and kindness has been tremendously helpful. And you can find out more about Elinor and her work at elinorpredota.com. I'm going to spell it ELINORPREDOTA.com. And later in the show, we're going to hear about her upcoming offering, which is for white folks who are wanting to reconnect with ancestors through storytelling, and in that process, dismantle white supremacy. So Elinor, welcome to Bespoken Bones. It's such a great privilege to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm so honoured and pleased to be able to be here. I love your podcast. I listen to every episode, and I find it so nourishing. So it feels really good to be able to offer something back to you and the podcast and to your community that has built up around the podcast.
That's great. Yeah. I want to start just by asking you about your work, actually, about ancestral storytelling. What is that?
Well, I started off on the path of ancestral storytelling a few years ago now. I realised that storytelling was something I'd always done, and I started the apprenticeship with the Scottish Storytelling Centre, which we're lucky enough to have up here in Edinburgh. And I realised some way into that journey that my ancestors were asking for their stories to be told. And I started with my maternal grandfather, because his, to my current knowledge, his is the most exciting story and has a lot of depth and paradox and complexity in it. And through that process, and also through the process of relating to grief and death, there's always been a lot of grief in my life, and no more death than in an average life, I don't think, but there seems to have been a lot of grief, a large burden of grief alongside that. So that those two things together made me think about what stories our ancestors have to tell us. And alongside this, my mother has been doing genealogical research for quite some time, picking up where a great aunt of mine left off. So I actually have a resource, which I feel very blessed to have, of information about various ancestors. And it became apparent that they had much more complex and nuanced and multifarious stories to tell than might be apparent just from thinking, oh, well, this great whatever was a rector in a rural church in the borders between Wales and England. I mean, what's interesting there? Or oh, that's just my granddad, or my great granddad. Oh, he used to be a postman and he led a Welsh male voice choir when he retired. And yet when I actually dug deeper, there is so much richness and complexity in their lives, and they connect up with it became apparent to me how the global processes that have shaped our lives today and that have been going on for hundreds of years, and I'm talking about things like capitalism, like white supremacy, like colonialism, that those were all present in each of their lives in different ways. And so far I've focused on my maternal grandfather's story, and through that I've both connected more deeply to him, understood him better as a person because he's an ancestor who I knew in life, and gained a deeper understanding of my place within the kind of the cross-cutting currents of activism, resistance, racism, anti-Semitism, a whole big package.
I think that there's, as a white person who has grown up in the United States on the North American continent, like I can really, I guess I notice the impact of that legacy, right? But in talking with white folks who haven't necessarily grown up in here, it's like, well, if you grew up in England or if you grew up in France, like I'm curious because I have heard folks say, well, I didn't have anything to do with that, right? Like my ancestors didn't do that, and so like what does that have to do with me? I'm not a part of that system, right? And so like you are a white woman, you're living in the United Kingdom, you grew up there, you live there, but yet you have this understanding of like, I am a part of these systems of oppression. And I really would just like to frame, I think, the whole interview by asking you to speak a little bit to how you understand being a white person living on the land that you live on. How do you benefit from white supremacy?
Mm-hmm. The first way I benefit from white supremacy is in all of the wealth and resources that came to Europe and specifically to Britain because of colonialism. And the thing that I think a lot of people in Britain and France and Belgium and other European countries that had colonies, they tend to think, oh, colonialism was a long time ago, and it actually wasn't that long ago. Rhodesia only gained independence and became Zimbabwe in I think it was 1979, 1980. So first of all, they think colonialism, oh, that was something that happened in the Victorian era. And second of all, I think there's a lack of education and understanding about just what colonialism gave to Europe as a whole, and particularly to European countries that had colonies. There was an inflow of money. There was an inflow of a wealth of intellect, of labour, of all kinds of resources that came to Britain. So even if somebody was working class in the 1940s, yes, this was before the National Health Service, before the welfare state was instituted by the Labour government after the Second World War, but they still benefited from the existence of infrastructure like public transport, like roads, like sewage and water systems that were made possible by the wealth that Britain was able to accumulate, whether that was in private hands or in the hands of government. And I think we lack an understanding. White people in Europe and Britain tend to lack an understanding of white supremacy, even left-wing, progressive, radical, whatever kind of, whatever people's politics are. We don't grasp. We might grasp that racism exists, but we don't tend to grasp what white supremacy and how white supremacy affects us, in that we have an assumption of our right to exist in the world as white people, where we don't even have to think about the fact that we're white people, regardless of our class background, regardless of our income, regardless of our work. That is a legacy of white supremacy that we are simply not aware of. And I'll give you an example. I used to work for a development education charity in the north of England. And every year we would hire what was called Fortress Europe, which was an educational display about the journey of asylum seekers and refugees through the British immigration system. And every year I would create and set up an additional display to go alongside it. And on one side of it, there were a whole load of information questions and interactive things for people to engage with. On the one side, there was a question: should I be able to live in any other country in the world? And the vast majority of people who came through the doors were white. And the vast majority of people said, yes, I should be able to live anywhere I want in the world. On the other side of the display, after they'd gone round a few of the the elements of it, there was a question: should anybody be able to come and live in Britain from anywhere else in the world? And the vast majority of them said no. And that mindset is a legacy of colonialism and white supremacy that is largely unconscious for white people in Europe and in Britain. And that's kind of those parts, that material benefit, the psychological benefit, and that assumption of a right to exist anywhere in the world without having to answer to anybody, a kind of a boiled down way of a kind of what I boil down the benefits of colonialism and white supremacy for white people in Europe.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's really helpful. And I think this is the theme of our conversation today, right? Is how do we look at these stories that live in us, in our bodies, right? How do we start to pay attention to these stories that lived in our ancestors' bodies, and that continue to live in our bodies? And how do we start to allow those stories to move us in good ways, in heart open ways, where we can look at it without kind of shutting down in shame or dismissiveness or denial, or kind of like that's done, that's in the past. Like, how can we allow this to be a living, breathing thing? Because it is, right? We are, all of us alive on the planet right now are living and breathing, and white supremacy is also a living and breathing thing that resides in us, right? And so how do we engage with this? So, as a storyteller, one thing that I know that you think a lot about is telling stories from different perspectives, and kind of the power in shaping a story from different perspectives. So I'm wondering if maybe you'd be willing to tell us an ancestral story from different viewpoints, several viewpoints of this, or a couple of viewpoints of the same story, to kind of get this idea of like, how does history get written? How does history get embodied? And how does the lens that we're looking through really shape what we're able to see, right?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I'm going to tell my maternal grandfather's story in several different ways to kind of hopefully to demonstrate what you're talking about. So the first way I'm going to tell it is as I would have told it before I delved into his life. So my grandfather was Polish. He was born in southern Poland, somewhere near Częstochowa and Krakow, that kind of area. He was involved in the Second World War in some kind of way. I'm not really sure. And he came to Britain after the Second World War and met my grandmother, and they got married and had kids. And he worked in some kind of construction for a bit, and then he started his own business as a jeweler. And then when he retired, he spent a lot of time down the Polish club, and he was always really grumpy and quite critical of all of us in the family. And I mean, but he was really happy to see he had 3 daughters, and he eventually saw all of them married and having kids, and he was happy with that. And then after he retired, he spent a lot of time in the Polish club, and his English deteriorated, so I couldn't really have conversations with him anymore. And at his funeral, he must have been kind of a big wheel in the Polish club, because the church at his funeral was absolutely jam-packed. And there were all these old guys there in uniforms with medals and carrying Polish flags and regimental flags. And I'm not quite sure what that was about, but he must have done something interesting or that people respected him for. But, he never really told us what it was. So that's version 1.
That's version 1. It sounds like, lots of stories that we all tell about our ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
There's kind of like a surface level of historical kind of vague facts, or kind of like a right, but there's not there's no threads of kind of
detail.
Like content or detail or understanding.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so that's version 1.
Yeah. Okay, so here's version 2. My grandfather was named Elinor Predota, and he was born on the 18th of October 1921 in a tiny village called Bilcha, south of Kielce in southern Poland. He had an average life for basically a peasant at the time. He actually did quite well for himself. He joined the air training, the Air Force training school. And then in the summer of 1940, about a year after the German occupation of Poland, he and his sister Bronisława were caught doing something that had been forbidden. And he was taken with his sister and many other young people to be slave labour in Kempten labour camp in Germany. He was only there for 5 months, because after 5 months he escaped, ran all the way back to southern Poland and joined the resistance. He was captured twice more and escaped twice more from labour camps, each time coming back to join the resistance. Finally, in April 1944, he was captured and brutally beaten by SS guards and taken to Dachau, where he remained for the 11 months of the rest of the war. Thankfully, he was liberated by the United States Army in 1945, and after several months of medical care, he decided to move to Britain in the hope that he would find his sister Bronisława. After that, you might think his story gets a little bit boring after that, because after some medical care, after some training, being in one of the Polish divisions of the British Army, he moved to Birmingham in England. He met his future wife, Coral Main, and they got married and had their first daughter in 1950. So far, so boring. But the political machinations and drama wasn't over. Because members of the Polish resistance were seen as a threat to the Soviet overseer government in Poland, members of the resistance not just in Poland, but around the world, were spied on by the KGB. And my grandfather was absolutely convinced that the KGB were spying on him all the way through the 1950s. Then finally, in 1965, he became a naturalized British subject and was finally able to safely visit his family in Poland and be reunited with his sister Bronisława after all those years. So that's the second kind of more exciting, adventure-filled version of the story.
So he sounds like he was like the focus there. There's much more detail, but he's also you're bringing it through the lens of like his exploits fighting in the resistance.
Yeah. It's kind of in the first story, he's kind of like he's just my granddad. In this story, he's heroic.
He's heroic, but we still don't know anything about him or his heart or his being.
Yeah.
Just kind of like we're focused on his doing, his actions.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And he sounds like, a stand-up guy.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the third version is where, okay, I'll just tell it and then we can maybe chat about the differences between the versions afterwards. The first indication I got that my grandfather was anti-Semitic was when my aunt got engaged to her boyfriend. They didn't speak to each other for months because my aunt's boyfriend was Jewish. By the time the wedding came around, they'd been reconciled and grandfather looked just as proud as he did in all the other wedding photographs of his other two daughters. But that knowledge of the hatred in him for no other reason than somebody's ethnic and religious group lodged in me. He had similar distrust, dislike, and hatred for Russia and Russians, which, given the circumstances of Poland, I had a little more sympathy and compassion for. But when my mother started doing genealogical research, we also started to look a little bit into the history of the area that my grandfather was brought up in. And my mother and I visited our relatives near Kielce in 2008 in the autumn. And one of my mother's cousins, who's a young school teacher, took us on a tour of Kielce. And she shared with us a piece of its history, which is not widely known to British people, even of Polish descent, which is that at the end of the Second World War, after the Germans had left Poland, the Gentile citizens of Kielce rounded up all the remaining Jewish people they could find and massacred them. Given this knowledge and the knowledge of my grandfather's anti-Semitism, I both have compassion for him as someone who was brought up in a profoundly and directly anti-Semitic culture, and horror at the thought of what he might have done if he had been still in Kielce at the end of the war. Now, there's much more to my grandfather. He was absolutely dedicated. He was absolutely dedicated as a member of the resistance, fighting against German occupation of Poland. He was absolutely dedicated as a supporter and fundraiser for Solidarność during the struggle of that trade union in Poland against the USSR overseeing government. He was absolutely dedicated in his own way to the well-being of his family within his own narrow ideas about what well-being is. And he was absolutely dedicated to his work preserving the history of the Polish resistance once he retired, and dedicated himself to the local Polish club in Birmingham. So there are many, many virtuous qualities that I can look up to about my grandfather. And yet there is this heart of hatred and unthinking dismissal of a whole section of humanity that sits alongside that makes my grandfather such a complex and compelling ancestor for me to relate to as a storyteller and as a granddaughter.
Elinor, listening to all three versions, but especially this third one, like, I'm uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
I'm uncomfortable in my skin of like holding all of this paradox.
Yeah.
And it's not even my ancestor. I mean, it is my ancestors, right? Of
Yes.
course, it's like a representative of my ancestors, but it's like,
Yeah.
oh crap, like,
Yeah.
Okay, and it brings me back to you saying there's been a lot of grief in my life, and I imagine if you're willing to be with this level of complexity about one human life and to feel that level of discomfort, well, yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, it's like how, I mean, my next question is kind of like, well, how do we get willing to feel that uncomfortable? Right. Because I imagine that there is, both a lot of blessing that you receive being this person's descendant. I mean, your own commitment to radical politics and to resistance and right. And then, but also like the tension of, right. It's like, it's just, how do we reconcile? And this has been a question that's come up again and again as I've delved into the ancestral work, especially around race, is how do I reconcile, right, all of that inside of my body? How do I hold the tension of all of that inside of my body and not turn away from it and not overly identify with it either? Right?
Yeah. It is. I feel really blessed that I have been gifted with opportunities to learn skills and ways that have expanded my capacity to be with what is, whether that's comfortable or not. And it really, for me, it really comes down to really basic practices like sitting practice, like aura work, like journaling, anything that can support us to keep turning towards rather than turning away from what is. And I think there's the big piece for me that people don't want to take on is responsibility. Not responsibility for what our ancestors did, because my grandfather is responsible for my grandfather's thoughts, words, and actions. I am responsible for my thoughts, words, and actions. It makes no sense for me to take on responsibility for what he did. And I have a responsibility to face and accept the things that he did. Not accept in the sense of saying, oh, it was okay that he did those things, but actually to face and recognize, oh, he did all of those things.
That happens.
Yeah, that happened. That was who he was. That's reality. And I think one of the things that is really hard for many people is to be willing, or even to be willing to take on that responsibility, because there's a strong fear that, oh, if I look, then something. And we're not always even certain about what the then something is. But it's like, if I look, if I face this, if I experience this, if I sit with this discomfort, whether that discomfort is the knowledge of my grandfather's anti-Semitism or whether it's being silent for 10 minutes. The reason it's so hard to be with that discomfort is because we have this fear that if I feel this discomfort, then something dreadful will happen, then I'll have to do something I don't want to, then my life will change, then all my false beliefs about myself will be proven true. A whole load of potential thens, then something. So it's not just the reality that we're turning away from, it's actually the fear that we're turning away from. And I think becoming, the self-knowledge of, recognizing, this is fear, not just looking at, okay, this is what my grandfather did, said, who he was, but in looking at him, I'm feeling something right now, knowing this about my grandfather. I'm also feeling fear about the feeling that arises because I know something about my grandfather that I didn't want to know. So it's these layers of turning away that are all based in that fear that our false beliefs about ourselves are true. And I think the more we can turn towards our false beliefs and just look at them and accept that, oh, that's what they are. They're not true, but they're there. Okay. And I think the and is really important. It's like, I feel fear digging into an ancestor's past and their story. And I want to know about them. I feel fear what will happen if I find out and then know something that I cannot unknow about an ancestor. And I am committed to developing and continuing to build relationship and be in relationship with my ancestors. So it's okay, this and. So it's that being able to, on the one hand, one kind of balances the other out, and on the other hand, sometimes this and can be an added layer of discomfort because it's yet another level of complexity, yet another paradox. And I think part of it is that we think of all these things as problems to be solved, and we think we need to solve them. And actually we don't. All we need to do is be here now with what is. We don't need to solve any problem. We don't need to get anywhere with it.
Oh, it's so simple.
Yeah. Oh, I know. Yeah.
Just that whole thing. Yeah. I it's so interesting because you and I have talked about white women's spirituality seminars, right? And that we think they're kind of helpful, sure, maybe, and also kind of like gross, like like just the kind of when there is bypass, the bypassing, right? And not to say that all of all of that is that, but there is definitely that, right? On one end of the spectrum of like just the turning away from, right? Instead of the turning towards. But then there's also this other, what I think of as problematic piece of like turning too much towards the over-identification with, which is the other end of the spectrum of like, because I'm white, I don't get to have magic. I don't get to have spirituality, because those things aren't authentic to my cultural traditions, and or because I have good politics and I'm willing to turn towards the atrocities that my ancestors committed, I'm somehow going to sacrifice that. I mean, and maybe I'm oversimplifying here, but I see these things as kind of like two ends of a spectrum. Of like, how do I be this person in this body with the skin color that I have, with the ancestry that I have? How do I hold the complexities of my ancestors, of the privilege that I'm continuing to enjoy? And how do I have a spiritual practice, spirituality that's authentic, that's not appropriative, but that also is, it speaks truly through me and speaks to my heart. And I get to have the full experience of being human, just as everyone else does, right? I don't have to like limit parts of myself to somehow pay for the crimes of my ancestors. So yeah, I just wonder if you could speak a little bit to that and kind of how you hold that.
And for me, I mean, I started out, as many of us do, kind of in the soup of the new age world. So I've been on my own journey from thoughtless appropriation to, oh my God, I can't do anything, to where I am now, which hopefully is a more balanced and integrated place. For me, I think what made the biggest difference was when I moved to Scotland in 2000. I had asked to be taught magic. That was my request of whatever powers were listening. And that happened not, although I made connections with pagan communities, that for the most part and for the deepest part happened through deep immersion in the place and the land that I was living with. So I think for me, the ways that I mean, I am constantly looking at, okay, is this practice of mine in integrity with me, not with what anybody else thinks I ought to be doing, but if I'm here and now, if I'm in alignment, if I'm present with what is taking on this practice, is using this practice, is engaging in this practice in integrity for me. And some things I've actually stopped doing because I've realized actually, no, that's not an integrity for me. And one of those is using the chakra system. So what I've done instead is I've looked for and found through a whole set of interesting connections a way of working with sound and energy and different parts of the body, which goes back in some ways to Babylonian tradition and in some ways to ancient Greek tradition, plus a whole dollop of my own unverifiable personal gnosis. But for the most part, my practice is to return to, okay, where am I here and now? And where I am is always in a place. And in that place, there are always other beings, whether those are human beings, whether those are living beings. They might be plant beings, rock beings, animal beings, insect beings, she, which is the Gaelic word for what most people call fairies, whether they're dead spirits of dead people, whether they're spirits of, plants and animals and rocks. Where I am has a resource of relationships for me to recognize that I'm part of already. Because wherever we are, we're part of a web of relationships. It's just a matter of whether we recognize that or not. And also that's where I am in present time, kind of like horizontally, I think of it, and where I am in vertical time is I am the child of a child of a child of a child of a child, going all the way back to the beginning of the universe. So I orient myself by my place in the current web of relationships with all beings that are here right now, and in relationship to those who have come before me. And that's obviously ancestors of blood, but also ancestors of nurturance, ancestors of spirit, ancestors of idea and intellect. So that's how because I think as human beings, I firmly believe that as human beings, magic is our birthright. And colonialism and capitalism and white supremacy, one of the tragedies of that for white people, just in terms of white people, is being cut off from that heritage, being cut off from that, particularly in Britain, where the Industrial Revolution happened very early, and where the British government tried out all of its colonial policies in Ireland and Scotland first before it tried them in the rest of the world. We have an unrootedness, and I think that's why so often we look for spiritual and magical riches in other traditions, because they have an unbroken lineage. But we can't just take ourselves over there to where there's an unbroken lineage, because that doesn't actually help to root us. Not to dismiss people who have a genuine vocation and calling to a lineage that comes from a different culture than the one they were raised in, or a different ancestry than the one they were raised in. But for the most part, we are, as a people, white people are desperately seeking for connection, for rootedness. And for me, the way that I'm able to do that in a way that's in integrity, that doesn't dismiss my right to magic as a human being just because I'm a white person, and that doesn't dismiss the idea of whiteness and white supremacy as a problem altogether, is to be here on this land with the ancestors that I have. And through those connections and through those relationships, I find a lot of strength and a lot of resource to actually keep myself aligned and in integrity and stepping forward to do what work is mine to do, to tackle white supremacy, to tackle racism, to tackle colonialism, along with all the other oppressions. And ancestors are more problematic than non-human beings and more than human beings. And yet there's such a richness there, because for me, there's something really humbling. There's a real humility in a very positive way to sitting with my ancestors and recognizing that my life depends on their lives, and their lives depend on their parents' lives, and their parents all the way back. There's a real sense of appropriate smallness in recognizing myself as just one small pearl on a chain.
So I just really want to punctuate this point that I hear you making, which is, I am able to do my work in dismantling white supremacy and dismantling colonialism because of these stories that I examine from my grandfather and from my ancestors. This is a source of richness and support for this iteration of the flame of resistance that burned in my grandfather, which burns in me. It's the same spirit of resistance honed to be in alignment with heart, with the spirits of place and goodness. Am I getting it?
Yes, absolutely. And the thing that's difficult about working with ancestors, in that they're so complex, and as white people, a lot of our ancestors were involved on, I guess, quotes, the wrong side of the development of how white supremacy and racism and colonialism developed in their moment of history, is that actually being able to hold that thing that I'm not okay with love and compassion, and to keep looking at it alongside all of the positive stuff. Actually, even apart from the richness of knowing in this case, my grandfather in as much detail and wholeness as I can, it's great practice for being in situations where I'm challenging someone's racism, or someone is challenging what they've experienced as my racism. It's great practice for, it's okay to be with discomfort, to be with the discomfort of conflict. It's okay to be with the discomfort of realizing I've done something I didn't realize I was doing. That actually this comfort by itself isn't necessarily a problem, and that being with discomfort can be a source of depth and richness, because it means that we're not afraid. There is nowhere we're afraid to go. And that is such, as an activist, to be able to say that there is nothing I am afraid to look at, there is nowhere I'm afraid to go, is such a boon and such a gift.
There's nowhere I am afraid to go. Yeah, it's great. It's great. I really want to invite other people into that practice, right? And I think this might be a great time for you to talk a little bit about the next thing that you have coming up for you, which is an invitation for folks to come into this exact practice with you. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm offering a course called Rooted, Telling Our Ancestors' Stories, from the 1st of August to the 7th of November this year. And it's an invitation specifically to white people and to others who benefit from white privilege in significant ways, to engage with, not with all of their ancestors at once, obviously, but to pick an ancestor who is at that sweet spot between knowable and So they're someone that you know enough about to know what their name is, where they were born, things like that, and who you're not already too uncomfortable with to want to investigate. I'm not going to ask. I don't want to ask people off the bat to go to the most problematic ancestor they have, because that would be unkind and not actually terribly helpful in learning the skills and the tools of ancestral storytelling. Because by picking one ancestor, we'll be looking at how do we research them, how do we find out about them, both in everyday ways and in more magical ways. And then, as I did with that story of my grandfather, what are the different stories we can tell? What are the different stories you can tell about that person? How does the way that story is told, how does the information that it's included and excluded change your viewpoint on that ancestor, change how you feel about that ancestor, change what resources are accessible to you about that ancestor? And also there'll be the opportunity to begin healing and integration, because when you're researching ancestors, you never really know what you're going to uncover. You might have some inklings. So there will be space for people to begin to heal and integrate that knowledge. And we'll be using altar time journaling, ritual, and storytelling in class together. And then we'll be using that resource of our knowledge and the storytelling to reflect on our own place within racism, white supremacy, colonialism, and witness each other in saying, okay, this is where I am. This is what I've learned from this ancestor. These are what my next steps will be.
So, and just wanting to let folks know where they can find out more information about that, which is on your website, elinorpredota.com/rooted.
Yes.
And even if folks just go to your website, I'm sure that they'll find their way.
Yeah.
And that starts August 1st.
Yeah.
Yeah. Elinor, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your heart in this work. Mm-hmm. It's really motivational and helpful for me. So thank you.
Good. Thank you so much. It's been really enjoyable and helpful for me to explore more expansively in a conversation like this. So thank you.
Great. And just wanting to say thank you to the ancestors that have supported this conversation and to all of the ancestors of all of those who are listening. We hope that this brings you praise and honor. Thanks, folks, for listening to this episode of Bespoken Bones. And if you have felt inspired by what you heard, it would be great to hear from you. If you want to learn more about the sexual and ancestral wellness work that I offer in my private practice, you can go to trancestralhealing.com. That's my website, and learn more there. And just really want to say thanks for all of the supportive messages, the sharing that you're doing, your personal stories, your feedback. Keep it coming. I am Pavini Moray, and I'll be back every full and new moon with more embodied goodness and ancestral wisdom. Blessings on you and your ancestors.